Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here with you to share the outcome of my Nuffield Farming Scholarship journey, as I've looked to understand how we can increase the uptake of integrated pest management in the arable farming sector across the UK, with grateful thanks to the John Stewart Foundation as my sponsor. FAO define integrated pest management as the careful consideration of all available plant protection methods, from the prevention to the monitoring to control using all available methods and evaluating that approach before you start the next season. So if in the UK we already select effective rotations, we choose resistant varieties, we use thresholds and models, and we think the research and knowledge exists, perhaps a mindset is the key to adoption. With a background in farm advice, an interest in social science and farmer and mindset thinking, and a real desire to see an increase in integrated pest management uptake, I set off on my Nuffield Farming Scholarship to find out more. But I was particularly interested in what the incentives and barriers to adoption are, and what strategies and best practice we can learn from around the world that we can put into practice here in the UK. My Nuffield Farming Scholarship journey started from the comfort of my home office, using the opportunities that coronavirus provided. And I had the pleasure to talk to people such as Vinod Pandit on a Friday night in his home in Nepal, talking about the PlantWise programme that he runs as part of CABI, working with plant doctors in rural communities of Nepal, taking a prevention-first approach to IPM. And Melanie and Gemna, who run the Kiwi Green labelling programme for kiwi fruit in New Zealand, which is all about encouraging the adoption of IPM measures. But when it was possible to travel again, I started on a farm only an hour away in my home county with a laying hen producer, and then travelled through England, through Scotland, over to the Netherlands, the home, arguably, of IPM, to Kenya, where they're putting IPM into practice 100% in their horticulture and cut flower production, as well as maize with subsistence farmers, and then to the USA, to perhaps see the oldest and the most innovative of practices in a similar environment to ourselves. And these practices that I saw were many and varied. They took all sorts of different forms. For example, the push-pull technology systems that is used, developed by Professor Khan and his team at ISIPE in Kenya. And it's a simple system using a crop often called Desmodium as an intercrop planted between the maize rows, and Napier grass planted as a trap crop around the outside. The Desmodium acts as a push to the pests, and the Napier grass acts as an attractant to the beneficials. Desmodium is also a legume and nitrogen fixer, and has an allelopathic effect on striga weed, one of their key weeds. I learnt about biologicals. The papaya mealybug, which is a really bad pest in eastern Kenya, has been controlled through the growth of a parasitoid wasp by the CABI programme. And they're now releasing this in eastern Kenya, as it's very host-specific, and it's controlling the devastating papaya mealybug for those subsistence farmers. Or in a completely different sector, for laying hen producers that's using predatory mites to control their red spider mites, eliminating the use of insecticides, and having a real beneficial effect on their environment and their human health of their staff. Or the mating disruptors seen here in an apple orchard in the USA, which is used to release a pheromone against the codling moth males. It's the same as the females. They can't find them. I'm looking forward to sharing these practices and the things I've learnt about IPM as I go and speak to farmers in discussion groups with agronomists and advisors, and in my report. But I wanted to really share with you today to answer the question about how we can encourage the adoption of IPM. And the words of Joyce Gamer, who I talked to in Kenya, have really stuck with me. Joyce said, there's two types of IPM. There's regulatory IPM, and there's voluntary IPM. Regulatory IPM is where we have to do something because of the rules. Perhaps our market means that we can't use a chemical approach and we need to use biologicals. Perhaps resistance or inactive's been withdrawn, or perhaps government policy dictates we need to. And if we think about the growers that we know that are using these practices, probably most are using that. But I'd like to move, and my aspiration is we can move people into the voluntary IPM approach, where we're doing it because we see the business benefits and the benefits in terms of environmental and social consciousness. And as I travelled and spoke to farmers, to agronomists, to researchers and advisors, to CEOs and risk managers, the conversations kept coming back to this model, the reset mindset model. Originally developed by Lamb, Vessels and Janssen, they said that if we can push all of these 5 buttons, we'll get change. Rules, education, social pressure, economic stimuli, and tools. And it's this that I'd like to use to frame my findings and learnings for you today. Joe Rolfe is an organic carrot producer in Norfolk. Joe said to me that to understand and how to control his carrot root fly, he said he needed to take a step back and understand the pest itself, to understand its life cycle, its habitat, where it overwinters. And he was then able to use that technical knowledge and learning to implement different drilling and lifting methodologies and using a trap crop in his farm. Technical training, knowledge, and capacity building made a difference for the adoption of IPM for Joe. But IPM isn't just about technical knowledge and understanding. Dr. Ivan and Evelyn, who I met in Kenya, all talked to me about how a chemical approach results in a quick chemical knockdown of a pest or a weed or a disease. And they believed that if we understood that an IPM approach or a biological approach would work, but it might take 3 days to have an effect and you might look different, that would encourage the adoption. Or something else that I was really keen to look at was about the concept of risk. And I had the pleasure to speak to Vanessa Clark, who's a risk manager for Action for Children in a completely different industry to ourselves. We talked about the concept of risk appetite and risk tolerance and how we could manage risk, create risk management strategies. And I think that if we could understand risk as an industry and talk between agronomists and advisors about what level of risk we're prepared to take, that would encourage the adoption of IPM. Perhaps we're more risky or less risky than we think. Philippa Dodds is a soft fruit agronomist in Scotland. Philippa talked to me about creating a community of practice between a grower, herself as the agronomist, and the biological manufacturers. She said that really worked, so they could try the products together to learn how they worked, to learn how best to apply them. And she then built up that confidence to try these new measures. This has been found in all sorts of different areas. Lead farmers, as Abdullah Al-Shakib, who's done research with 55,000 households in Bangladesh, believe that lead farmers, monitor farmers, our peer-to-peer learning made the difference. Or the consumer drive, as I saw as the consumers in the States at Door Creek Orchard were prepared to eat ugly fruit. Andrew Watson said to me, reiterated to me, a business has got to make money. Andrew hasn't used insecticides on his cotton for the last 18 years. He's been monitoring the pest levels and his beneficial levels and found out that he could manage that, apart from a couple of years ago where the beneficials weren't going to be enough. But he said to me that it was the 1% premium from the Better Cotton Initiative and the extra $1 a bale from Monsanto because of using IPM measures, which added 30,000 Australian dollars to his bottom line for a couple of years, gave him the opportunity to really test and trial his biologicals and beneficials. And that gave him the confidence of the intrinsic business benefits, and he believes that drove the long-term uptake of IPM in the cotton industry. That economic stimulus has made the difference. And Darren Schreers. Darren is a leek grower in South Australia. And we were talking, and he said he realised he needed to do something different. He was working with his entomologist, Paul Horn, who said, Darren, you really need to stop spraying. But he couldn't see a way of doing that. So he decided to take 3 leek plants and some 2 spotted mite, his pest, from the field, and he put them in a fish tank in his house under a grow light. Within a couple of days, he'd seen the numbers of the pest decline, and after a couple of weeks, he'd seen the 2 spotted mite were completely obliterated. He said that opened him up to a whole new world. He's now put IPM practices onto place across his whole business. He's put in place native trees and grass strips. He's using biologicals and beneficials, and he's using the tools, research and practices. But for him, that tool of seeing is believing really made the difference. And rules. Rules really do drive adoption, and because we have to do it. But Bram in the Netherlands told me the story of Jan Koppert, who, when he saw insecticide resistance building in his cucumber crops, went out to find something different to control his spider mite. He came across Phytocillus, the beneficial predatory mite, that he then grew in his glasshouse in his back garden, and seeing the success, his neighbours all said, "Can you produce some for me as well?" And that resulted in the very successful biological control company, Koppert, that we know today. So if we're to drive change and to drive the adoption of IPM, it isn't about any one of these areas in isolation. We can't simply give people the money if they don't have the understanding or the tools of how to do it. Or perhaps we need the communities of practice around us to say you're heading in the right direction. We really need an integrated approach across all of these areas to enact change. So in conclusion, as farmers, as advisors, as agronomists, as DEFRA and the industry, these are my recommendations. That we invest in training and we put IPM at the front and centre of that. That we create a community of best practice, of champions. That we ensure the economics are there, those intrinsic business benefits, alongside possible incentives. That we research the tools that are there. In Kenya, they're waiting for the next biological. Here, we wait for the next active. And perhaps we can achieve the change before the rules set in. Perhaps we need to reset our mindset. But at conference, I'd like to leave you with this thought. My Nuffield light bulb moment came talking to Dr. Jonathan Lundgren and his colleagues at Ecdysis in the USA. Jonathan said to me, for every 1 pest, there's 1,700 beneficials. If we can build a healthy ecosystem, if we can focus on plant health, soil health and biodiversity, perhaps pest, weed and disease control would occur naturally in our environments. If we're really to move forward, perhaps we should think beyond IPM and think about adopting a system rather than a component. It's not what we can kill or control, it's what we can encourage and introduce. Long-term systems change, perhaps towards a more agroecological approach, perhaps should be our ultimate aspiration for achieving integrated pest management. Happiness is talking agriculture around the world, and I'd like to say a big thank you to the Nuffield Farming Scholarships Trust and the John Oldacre Foundation for allowing me this opportunity. To my family, friends and work colleagues that have allowed me the time and space to travel, to be challenged and to share. And to the farmers, researchers, organisations that have hosted, made me laugh, smile, share their passion and expertise. Thank you to them. And I look forward to sharing this further as we go forward and putting some of those recommendations into practice. Thank you.